You said it felt easy to talk. That's how you described it at the time, because nothing about it felt forced. They kept asking small things, nothing that looked like pressure, just enough to keep you going. You answered without thinking much about it. They didn't interrupt. They stayed quiet and kept the focus on you, not the situation, not anything else. Everything kept coming back to what you felt, what you noticed, what you reacted to. You didn't stop that, because it didn't feel like something you needed to stop. You remember what they asked. Not direct questions, just small ones that brought you back to yourself again and again. What bothered you? What you didn't like? What you avoided? You told them, piece by piece, without seeing the full picture. They kept it going. They didn't rush it, didn't push, didn't make it obvious. They just stayed with it and returned to the same direction every time, calm and consistent. And you stayed with them. You said it felt like they understood you, and you called it care because that made it feel safe. That word made it easier to stay open. But you remember what was actually happening. They kept the focus on you long enough for you to give them what they needed. They didn't force anything. They just didn't let it move away from you. And you kept answering. You filled the space, explained things you didn't need to explain, and said more than you planned to say. They listened, and that was enough. That's the part you see now. They didn't need to figure anything out, because you already showed them. You gave it to them in small pieces, over time, without stopping to see what it was becoming. You said it didn't stand out at the time. You remember that moment clearly, but you chose not to treat it as important. They said something small, something that didn't fully sit right, but it wasn't enough for you to stop the conversation. They crossed it quietly. Not in a way that forced you to react, just enough for you to notice it. You felt it immediately, even if you didn't name it out loud, and that moment stayed with you longer than it should have. You didn't stop it. You answered instead. You explained what you meant, clarified your tone, and made sure nothing could be taken the wrong way. That felt easier than holding the line and seeing what would happen next. They stayed with it. They didn't pull back or correct themselves. They let you do the work of smoothing the moment out, and they watched how quickly you did it. That's what you didn't stop. You remember what they did next. They came back to it, not the same words, but the same direction. They asked again, just slightly differently, just enough to keep it moving without making it obvious. You answered again. You kept it calm and made sure there was no tension left in the moment. You made it easier for the conversation to continue without interruption. They watched that. Not the words, not the explanation, but your reaction. They saw how quickly you made space for it and how easily you adjusted to keep everything smooth. You said it wasn't worth stopping. You said it didn't matter enough to turn into something bigger. You said it would pass if you didn't give it attention, and that's what you chose to believe. But it didn't pass. It stayed in the way the conversation shifted. It stayed in the way your words became the focus instead of the topic. It stayed in the way they kept returning to you instead of moving forward. You saw that. You remember the second time it happened, and it didn't feel new anymore. You already knew the shape of it before it fully formed, and you recognized it as it was happening. And you stayed the same. You answered, you explained, and you adjusted your words again so it wouldn't stretch into something uncomfortable. You chose to keep it smooth instead of stopping it. They stayed the same too. They asked, they returned, and they didn't move away from that point. They said it was just a question, just trying to understand, just making things clear, but nothing actually changed. That was the first boundary. Not when they crossed it, but when you let it stay where it moved. You didn't push it back, and you didn't stop it. You adjusted around it. And they saw that clearly. You said it was easier to explain things early. That's how you described it once it started happening more often. They kept coming back to the same point, so you started getting ahead of it. They didn't change what they were doing. They asked again, they returned to the same places, and they kept the focus on you. Not the situation. Not anything else. Just you. So you adjusted. You added more before they could ask. You made your tone softer before they could question it. You made sure your meaning was clear before it could be turned into something else. They stayed the same. They listened, they asked again, and they kept coming back to your words instead of moving forward. They said they were trying to understand, but the same moment kept repeating. And you kept adjusting. You remember that, don't you? The point where speaking stopped feeling natural. Not uncomfortable, just controlled in a quiet way that stayed in the background. You weren't just talking anymore. You were preparing what you said before you said it. You were shaping your words before they left your mouth. You were making sure everything landed safely. They didn't ask you to do that. You started doing it on your own. That's the shift. They kept doing what they were doing. They repeated, they returned, they didn't move away from it. And you adjusted around it until it became normal. That's how the balance changed. They didn't take control. You made space for it. You said it became normal. Not all at once, but slowly enough that you stopped questioning it. The same moments kept happening, and after a while they didn't stand out the way they did at the beginning. You remember when you stopped reacting to them. They stayed consistent the whole time. They came back to the same point, asked in different ways, and kept the focus on you. Not the situation. Not anything else. Just you. That part never changed, no matter how many times it happened. You adjusted to that without calling it adjustment. You started speaking differently before they even asked, shaping your words earlier and softening your tone sooner. You made sure nothing you said could be turned into something else, even before it could be questioned. They didn't change. They still returned to your words, still avoided moving forward, still kept the conversation in the same place. It didn't matter how clearly you explained it, the same moment kept repeating. You saw that clearly. You remember finishing a sentence and already knowing what would come next. You remember hearing the same kind of question before it was even asked, and you remember preparing for it. And you stayed in it. You kept answering, kept explaining, and kept making it easier for everything to continue. You carried the effort of keeping it calm while they repeated the same behavior again and again. They didn't need to push harder. They didn't need to raise their voice or make it obvious. They just stayed the same, and that was enough to keep it going. They repeated the same pattern. They avoided giving you a clear answer. They said they understood, but nothing actually changed, no matter how many times it came back. And you carried it further. You carried the responsibility of keeping the conversation smooth. You carried the effort of making sure nothing sounded wrong. You carried the weight of holding it together while they stayed exactly the same. They stayed the same. You changed. That's what made it work. Once you start adjusting before anything even happens, the control is already in place. It doesn't need to be forced when it becomes normal. You said it didn't feel like control. You said it didn't look like control. You said it wasn't that serious. But you remember this clearly. You were careful all the time. You were thinking before speaking and adjusting before being asked, and you stayed in that position. And they were still doing the same thing. That's the pattern. Not loud. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just repeated. Steady. Unchanged. And that was enough. You said it didn't feel like control, and you kept that word because it let everything stay where it was. You called it something softer so you wouldn't have to deal with what you were already seeing. That choice made it easier to continue without changing anything. They didn't change, and you remember that clearly now. They repeated the same things, avoided the same answers, and said it would get better without showing anything different. You saw that pattern, even when you didn't say it out loud. You adjusted, and that's the part that stayed consistent. You made things smoother, calmer, easier to continue. You explained more than you needed to and carried the effort of keeping everything steady. They stayed the same. That's what makes it clear now. You remember knowing what was coming before it happened. The same question, the same shift, the same return to you. You recognized it while it was happening, not after. You stayed anyway. You said it wasn't enough to call it control. You said it wasn't serious enough, clear enough, or obvious enough. You gave it a name that let you stay where you were. But you also remember this. You were careful all the time. You were thinking before speaking, adjusting before being asked, and shaping everything to avoid the same moment repeating again. That wasn't random. That was the pattern. They repeated, avoided, and didn't change. You adjusted, carried, and kept it going. That's how it held together. And once you see it without changing the name, it stops feeling neutral. It becomes something that asks for a decision, even if nothing around you changes. You see it now. If you decide to.